Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Achieving Our Country, an Academy of Citizen Activism hosted by the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School and under the direction of Professor Cornell William Brooks. My name is Devin Jerome Crawford, Staff Director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, and I will be your host for the next 2 days. It is a pleasure to be joined by all of you across the country and indeed across this world as we come together at such a pivotal time in the life and history of our country. This is an opportunity for us to come together to collaboratively explore how we might together achieve our country, in the words of that prophetic Black bard, James Baldwin. It was in his book, The Fire Next Time, that James Baldwin implored to all of us that if we are to come together as a collective people, we can change the history of this country and achieve our country. And this is indeed the ideal and the purpose of our convening this evening. Now, we know that all of us have been through many difficult times in the past year. We've all been touched by the global pandemic of COVID-19, where 500 million lives have been lost due to this deleterious virus. But we also know that we have been impacted by the disease of COVID-19, a police brutality and violence that has taken the lives of Ma'Khia Bryant and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. All of these crises and all of these issues demonstrate empirically what we knew instinctively, that the issues of systemic racism and bigotry and violence and intolerance still grip the roots of our nation. And so we come together tonight in tomorrow to think about how we can collectively achieve this moment and rise to the occasion. Now, we want to let you know as we begin this critical convening that you can share this opportunity. We don't want you to watch this and engage in this academy by yourself, but we want you to share this via Twitter and Facebook, that we are live streaming at this very moment on the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative Facebook Live page and on our website, trotter.hks.harvard.edu. We want you to share it on all of your networks so that we can make justice trend tonight. And so as we begin this evening, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce the founder and the visionary of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, Professor Cornell William Brooks, our director. Professor Brooks is the Hauser Professor for the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations, and he is the Professor of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Brooks also serves as the visiting professor of prophetic religion and social justice at the Harvard Divinity School. We are so grateful to have Professor Brooks to open us up as we enter into this academy. Professor Brooks, you have the stage.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much, Devin, and thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. I want to welcome you to this inaugural spring convening of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, aspirationally entitled, Achieving Our Country, an Academy of Citizen Activism. We are humbled and honored by the speakers and the presenters and the panelists, but we are even more honored, more humbled by your presence as activists, those on the front lines of social justice, those of you who have exposed your bodies to great risk, who have manifested and reflected your conscience in the streets. So we welcome you to this convening. This convening is aspirationally entitled Achieving Our Country, an Academy of Citizen Activism. We invoke and are inspired by the prophetic words of James Baldwin, who wrote over 50 years ago, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. We understand as activists and advocates, as academics and artists, as those who yet believe that we can make this country what it ought to be and literally make this world what it should be. We understand profoundly that we face in this agonizing moment of injustice 3 threats to our democracy. These threats are in fact interrelated. These threats compound one another. These threats literally go to the core of who we are as a country, who we are as citizens. These threats might be described as the threat of COVID-19, and as my colleague so well put it, the threat of COVID-19 being a pandemic that manifested itself, yes, in 2019, but also yet began, if you will, in 1619. We understand that we face the threat of police brutality. We face the threat of rampant voter suppression. Many of us, in the course of this global pandemic, which has been responded to with a 50-state response, ineffectively, in ways that have left many of us grieving for our grandparents, grieving for our aunts and uncles, grieving for our children, grieving for those whom we have lost to this pandemic. We understand all too well as a matter of experience and empirically that Blacks, Hispanics, and Indigenous people are twice as likely as white non-Hispanic people to die after contracting COVID-19. We understand that our country is deeply divided along fissures of race and fault lines of ethnicity, and that this global pandemic has exposed those fault lines, exposed those fissures, and yet exacerbated and deepened those fissures and fault lines in our democracy. It is as if there is a large hospital standing in the midst of our democracy that seemingly disproportionately admits those who are people of color, seniors, people coming from rural communities, those disproportionately afflicted by COVID-19. We understand that this pandemic of COVID-19 is not unrelated to the pandemic of police brutality all across the length and breadth of our country. We have seen hashtag after hashtag, body after body rendered lifeless in the streets. Those are lives. Those are our siblings, our fellow children of God who have been laid in an unceremonial, violent grave. And in this moment, we grieve for them. That hospital that disproportionately admits those who are Black and brown and seniors, the rural folks coming from rural communities, indigenous folks, people who are in fact poor, is not unrelated, if you will. It is in fact related to the carceral state, a jailhouse, if you will, that admits Black and brown people who are pushed to the periphery of our democracy. We understand all too well that the carceral state has created, manifested a front end form of policing that is unjust. That is to say, when we have policing that results in police homicide being a leading cause of death among Black men, not unlike hypertension or cardiovascular disease, when young Black men are 21 times more likely to face violence at the hands of the police than their white counterparts, we understand that we are in the midst of a pandemic. But not only that, we have seen a pandemic of voter suppression from one end of the country to the other. And we understand that racial voter suppression is very much related to generational voter suppression. In other words, it's not about the Black and brown they, it's not about the young they, it is about the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational us in this moment. We face these pandemics of injustice in this moment. And there are some who may question whether or not we can be hopeful. There may be some who question whether or not we should lapse into a clinical state of despair. But we know all too well that we have within us a deep sense of resilience. Yes, we have leaderful movements, but we also have hopeful movements, hope-inspired movements in this time. We saw in the wake of George Floyd's death, a teenager who took her camera in the midst of police violence and filmed George Floyd's death and turned a video of a tragedy in our midst into a viral cause and call to action. Those who are religious yet believe that they can be called by God on Mount Sinai. Those who are not so religious understand that you can be circumstantially called. You can be historically called. You can be called because you care, because you have compassion for your neighbor. And so in this moment, we understand that this is a time for action. This is a time for movement. This is a time when those in the classrooms must join those in the streets. Those who are in the streets must join those who are on the screen and those who are on the stage. And those of us who are standing at the ballot box must also stand with those who are in the streets. We need those who are on reservations in suburbs and villages and cities, those who are protesting in streets and on roads, to stand together in this moment. And this is why we have convened this Academy of Citizen Activism. Now, I might note here that this is a hope-fueled and hope-inspired convening. We are mindful of the fact that there was a woman who was enslaved, who escaped slavery and returned again and again, crossing the Mason-Dixon line from the north into the south to deliver enslaved people to freedom. Her name was Harriet Tubman. Had Harriet Tubman considered the 70 slaves she freed to the 4 million enslaved, she might have given up. She did not predicate her leadership model. She did not predicate her activism. She did not predicate her advocacy on the dire math of reality, but it was a calculation of faith. In other words, our hope cannot be empirically demonstrated. It must be morally chosen. So in this convening, I'm calling on all of us to enter into this space with our authentic selves, to tell stories, to share stories, to partake of the strategies and the ideas and the means of change that we will hear and discuss and study together. The William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice is a social justice clinical based at the Harvard Kennedy School that extends Harvard-wide and countrywide. We partner with grassroots organizations, with justice-oriented government, and we partner with ordinary citizens to do this work. So over the course of the next 2 days, you're going to hear from advocates, from artists, activists and academics. You will hear from leading figures of the media. But most importantly, this is a conversation in which we will take our destiny into our hands by studying together, learning together, and partaking of a legacy that extends back, yes, to the days of Baldwin, but back into the days of our forebears. And we yet ask ourselves in this moment, if our forebears did all they did with what little they had, why can't we do even more with all that we have been given? So mindful of the legacy of William Monroe Trotter, who began his college career at Harvard well over 100 years ago. And soon after leaving Harvard as the first African-American Phi Beta Kappa graduate, he used his savings to start a newspaper, to begin a social justice career. And so he, partnering, discussing, collaborating with people like W.E.B. Du Bois and so many on the campus of Harvard, he convened a convening called the Niagara Summit, which launched the NAACP and the Civil Rights Revolution. We tonight also convene in the virtual space we call Harvard, but more importantly, we convene in an academy of citizen activism. We don't know 100 years from now what will be said of what we do tonight and what we do tomorrow. But what we do know is that in this moment, we have decided to act, decided to study, decided to learn, decided to collaborate, and decided to achieve our country and change the world. Thank you. Devin, back to you.